According to a leaked report from a Russian mill blogger, the likely survival time of a Russian soldier on the front line is just 12 days. Just how did we end up with such a high attrition rate? And more importantly, what is going on the front lines that has turned it into a brutal meat grinder, particularly for Russian forces who continue to send their people on a one-way trip? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is pretty crazy, actually, because this is a translated screenshot from a mill blogger, Russian mill blogger called Romanov, describing the life or the timeline of the average Russian. And bear in mind, this does not appear to be a scientifically, statistically compiled data. The Russian government may not even have this data because it seems like their attrition rate is so high that record keeping is kind of fallen to pieces. But we're going to talk about whether or not this is mathematically factually correct. It still reflects a really disturbing change in the realities of the front line. So here's what they talk about. So one, he's specifically focused on assault troops. These are what we would consider infantry. These are troops focused on conducting offensive operations. And we know that Russia is focused heavily on continuing its offensive war in Ukraine, right? Ukraine is primarily doing defensive operations here. And on some places and, some small localized counterattacks. But by and large, you're seeing Russian forces continually having to conduct these assault operations. And at this point, commanders see a typical assault trooper as totally expendable, right? They'll just get new ones. And the general staff of the Russian army demands advances, the mill blogger writes. And because for advances, there are more bonuses. And of course, he adds that that it's common for Russian officers and troops to take pay advances and that they have to then make sure they continually work off those pay advances, again, by acquiring bonuses, which can only be earned through seizing more territory. So he says the average life cycle, I think he means typical life cycle of an assault trooper, is 12 days. He says day 1, you sign a contract and arrive at the training ground. Days 2 to 11, you're training at the training ground. Day 12, you deploy to positions. He says in hotspots, out of 2 soldiers, only 1 will make it to their position at best. Because of enemy drones, no one is intercepting them, right? He just says basically drones are so massive and so extensive along the front lines that they, at best, are hitting, a lucky casualty rate is 50%. It's likely even higher for Russian operations. And we've heard this from other sources that essentially drones are constant on the battlefield. And before I show you actually some of the analysis of exactly what's happened to the Ukrainian front line, or what we used to call a front line, I want to mention, of course, guys, that it is fall. You guys know I am a dad of 2 kids under 2. I'm a triathlete. I'm a full-time content creator, and I need a lot of caffeine to get it by. That's why I founded Strike Gum. This is my company. It's made in the USA, veteran-owned, 90 milligrams of caffeine in each individual piece, 0 sugar, so it won't screw up your diet. And if you want an alternative to these energy drinks, Strike Gum is it. This thing and 1 piece of Strike Gum, same amount of caffeine. So go to strikegum.com and, of course, take advantage of our fall sale. 2 for 1, dude. You'd be crazy not to. Link's in the description. Okay, so here's what I really wanted to talk to you guys about. And this is the reality of the front line, what they call the gray zone. See, we still think, in some ways, of the front line is looking like this, where there is a front line with a small gray barrier between the two of them. But the reality is that this front line has become way more extensive, right? This says the gray zone is 2 or 3 kilometers. That's probably not true, right? When I was in Ukraine last year, we were seeing that basically up to 10 kilometers from the front line was inaccessible. And that was before fiber optic drones and some of these mid-range strategic drones rolled out. This is what the reality is, according to at least one source, right? And here's an English translated version on Instagram from Alcon Intel. It says that basically within the FPV winged winged FPV drones and quadcopter FPV drones controlled by fiber optics are basically within 25 to 30 kilometers. And you can see there's Ukrainian positions, maybe 5 kilometers from the front, flying all the way up to 20 kilometers into Russia or Russian-held territory, and Russian drone teams can fly their FPVs up to, again, an additional maybe 20 kilometers into Ukrainian territory. That includes then inside of that 20 kilometer, you have, of course, tanks, you have trailed artillery. Further back, you have electronic warfare jamming vehicles. And then further back still, you have things like rocket artillery. So you have this sprawling, right? But then they also acknowledge, that the reconnaissance UAVs or UAV robots have massively longer ranges still. And these can reach up to 40 kilometers of range. So they can go, again, deep into each other's front lines, right? And so, again, they're saying this analyst says that this is the general situation on a front. It's individually different. But what's crazy is what happens inside the gray zone. So here is an example of a gray zone. And you can see that it's depicting the ruins of a small village utterly covered in FPV drones. And we've seen this. I've been sent footage from Ukrainian drone teams who say that the skies over some of these contested areas are so dense that at times they are flying past each other. Russian reconnaissance and strike drones flying right past Ukrainian reconnaissance and strike drones. So what they describe is basically pure chaos in the gray zone. That there, in some places, are zigzags of trenches. Some are just people in ruins and charred out buildings, burnt down forests. Right? Along the roads, of course, burned cars, motorcycles, armored vehicles. We've seen that. In some places, the bodies of the dead just lie in the open because it's too dangerous to expose yourself to pick them up. But what's crazy is, in a lot of cases, what you have is essentially these points where inside the gray zone, they have what are called firing positions, right? Let's see if we can find it, where they talk about inside these what are ostensibly called firing positions are really just holes in the ground, right? So this is exactly, in fact, this is almost a screenshot of what I've seen in Ukrainian drone footage, in which these drones simply patrol these areas looking for any sign that a dugout is occupied, right? And once they see just the subtlest sign, for example, a tiny piece of trash, they'll throw strike drone after strike drone inside the bunker until they're sure everyone inside is dead, right? And all it means is that, hey, yesterday there wasn't this water bottle set outside the container. Now there is a water bottle. There must be someone in here. 5, 6 strike drones later, they go, there's no one in there. But the whole thing that's kind of preposterous is that you have a situation where, and let's see if I can find this, where essentially it's summed up by Alcon Intel pretty well. Right? Official reports call these positions firing positions, but in reality, they're an expanse where neither army fully controls the ground. Right? There are a 10 to 30 kilometer gray zone perpetually scanned by drones, struck by artillery, leaving soldiers and civilians alike in a state of constant exposure. And again, what I want to show you guys on this map really illustrates some of this, where you have these tiny positions. See, each one of these little dots represents a potential Ukrainian or Russian position, right? And you can see that in some cases, Ukrainians are far forward of Russian positions. In some cases, Russians are actually far forward of Ukrainian positions. But the key is that neither side has a complete sense of where the other one is. And these are tiny teams. Tiny teams that are 2 or 3 men hiding in these dugouts, just trying to survive in a lot of cases, right? And they point out the enemy is trying to find and then destroy these bunkers at any cost. In fact, the Ukrainians acknowledge there are very few infantrymen in the defense forces right now, so the positions are spread out great distances from each other. Right? Drones that hover overhead and drop bombs is terrifying, but again, single burrows are hastily dug depressions in the ground horizontally from a trench or at an angle, often under trees and bushes with a camouflaged entrance cover. Imagine spending, right, 2 to 4 square meters that can accommodate 1 or to 3 people imagine spending weeks and weeks and weeks hiding in there, essentially, unable to come out under any circumstances. And a lot of these several hundred-meter chains of trenches dug earlier and shelled more than once are now just empty, but our landscape that these firing positions can kind of dig into. In some cases, right, people are hiding in cellars and basements. As long as someone is alive in the hole and does not surrender, this territory is considered Ukrainian. The Russian army also feels the same lack of people and is afraid to advance while one or more fighters are sitting in a hole. So literally, I mean, this is like just absolutely totally absurd. Truly, just like a level of hellacious fighting that is almost unthinkable to us, right? Ideally, fighters in position should change every few days, but getting into and out of position is the most dangerous task of the war. And so therefore, it depends on the circumstances that can last dozens or dozens of days. Fighters try not to give themselves away. Even going to the toilet is difficult. Bags are often used. In truly desperation, when someone has to be evacuated, they're going to die, they can send one of these ground-based drones. But remember, they're obvious. It's obvious that a person's being towed by a drone. And oftentimes, here's a position, right, that soldiers will have to evac 1 to 7 kilometers by foot, then get picked up by a vehicle all the way to a fortified underground medical facility, right? Pickup trucks will take you to within 1 to 7 kilometers of the holes. They'll also carry cargo, ammunition, uniforms, food, water, and individual jammers. I think the takeaway, really, the thing I want you guys to understand is that when I see stuff like this, I think it's clear evidence that the Russians are projecting this image of strength, of infinite people, infinite resources. It's clearly not the case. The Russians seem as desperate and hard up for people as the Ukrainians. The fact that they're launching these tiny, tiny numbers of people in these assaults, massive, and you can see it, right? Like, here's a story from Kiev Post that's reporting that a lot of commanders literally are confiscating Russians' bank cards because they are terrified that these Russians are going to start to desert en masse. In fact, some leaked data shows that at the current rate of desertion, almost 70,000 troops, 1/10 of Russia's total contingent in Ukraine, could abandon their units sometime in 2025. These are huge and unbelievable numbers. But when you see this, the thing that should strike you as an American, first off, is that, this is like pretty terrible. But more than that is that I want you to understand that when the Secretary of Defense goes out in front of all his generals and says, guys, we need to focus on push-ups and sit-ups and running fast and not having beards and not being fat and all this other stuff. And it's like, guys, you in the war of the future, which is this war in Ukraine, you don't have the luxury of kicking people out because they're beard, because they have a beer gut, because they can't push up enough. Nobody gives a shit about how many push-ups you can do in these infantry positions. The fact is, and again, the Secretary of Defense said it himself. He said, would you want your son or daughter in this formation? I can tell you the formation I would want my son and daughter in. I would want them in a formation that is staffed to 115% of its manning requirements. Because in the war of the future, guess what? You know what it takes to be a drone pilot? Fucking at least one functioning hand. That's it. So I don't give a shit if the drone pilot backing them up, if they're good, I don't care if they have a gamer bod, okay? I couldn't care less. If you think the war of the future cares about your fucking beard, no. It doesn't matter, right? Like, none of these things are actually important to the war fighting in the future. Like, yeah, you probably got to be able to move 1 to 7 kilometers, but that's something that's pretty easily fixable, right? You can train most people to walk 1 to 7 kilometers. So, anyway, I think we should understand that things are not going as well for Russia as they purport, and more importantly, the war of the future is going to look a lot more brutal than the wars of the past. Anyway, that's all I had. Huge thank you to guys like Yanko Georgiev, Bastian Himmler, Michael Fry, Christine Suman, Chris Holmes, Deborah Oppenheimer, as well as all of our lieutenant tier members. I appreciate you. And hit subscribe.